The making of Rebel began with a single song. It began with A Better Freedom. Living in the UK, I'd been seeing the rise in anti-immigration sentiments boiling beneath the surface and bubbling up more and more both in the UK and in Western Europe. Certain political voices were having more and more sway when it came to fear-mongering about the threats of the so-called invasion or danger of immigrants. This message, wrapped in a sort of reformed nationalism, a message of Britain for the British, ultimately led to the Brexit vote taking place. The pro-Leave campaign slogan was "Take Back Control," a vague phrase insinuating that control had somehow been lost. In Europe, in facing the rising refugee crisis, there were voices spurring on panic, as though these wealthy countries, fully able to comfortably share their wealth and resources, would somehow be overrun by a threatening horde at their gates. The government in the UK shut their doors to refugees attempting to cross the Channel, portrayed immigrants as leeches. They sent some refugees already in the country to Rwanda, exporting them there, and encouraged by the government, there was an increase in refugee hatred, violence, and xenophobia. Refugee camps being attacked, asylum centers set on fire, citizens who even looked like foreigners treated hatefully in public. This spread to there being a debate about whether or not the Windrush population, people who had been in the UK for decades, should be returned to the countries they travelled to Britain from. And leaders in Parliament spouted truly hateful rhetoric against foreigners, which also led to adverse policy changes. The irony, of course, is that nationalism, although some believe it to strengthen and bolster a nation's position, actually weakens a country from within. Brexit has led, together with other factors, to a huge economic loss, destabilisation and depression in the UK. Cutting itself off from others has weakened its international connections. Nationalism is often just greed disguised as patriotism. And like all greed, it causes a sort of cannibalism to happen, where the nation begins to rot from the inside, feeding on itself, looking for someone to blame. And that blame usually falls on minorities. This sort of xenophobia is not new. If anyone has paid attention to the political and social climate in the US since 2001, you'll likely be familiar with this sort of messaging. Hateful and xenophobic rhetoric and policy made acceptable because of the perceived threat of safety and national security. The rise in Islamophobia, war, hostility, and violence towards foreigners is done in the name of securing and protecting the freedom of American nationals. And that's the insidiousness right there, saying it's all about freedom. Because people generally like freedom. They'd like to have it. They want to protect it. A threat to freedom, personal and national, is deeply motivating and leads to great reactivity. But if we are to look closer, with wiser eyes, at the way in which people in the West are being aroused to protect their so-called freedom, we discover that these things are in fact not free and do not result in freedom. Because what we're really talking about is fear, greed, suspicion, alienation, disconnection, hatred, violence, and isolation. As a Christian, I do believe that freedom is very important. Freedom, free will, is a gift given to humanity by God, a gift He Himself refuses to violate or infringe on. In 2 Corinthians, Paul writes that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. In other words, where the presence of God is, there is freedom there. But true freedom. Instead of walking around carrying the burden, the very heavy burden of hatred, we are invited to experience the freedom that lies in loving others. And that's what inspired this song. That's why I wrote this song and why it's called A Better Freedom. The way of Jesus' kingdom and life lived around him offers a better freedom than the kinds which we've often been sold and which we've often mistaken as the real thing. This song is an anthem of resistance. Resistance against the messaging that would tempt us towards xenophobia, anti-immigration, and anti-refugee lies. A statement of refusal to accept the white supremacist, racist, colonial beliefs that have been handed down to us and which many of our elders and forefathers believed in. Refusal to be cogs in the war machine against our fellow human beings, and choosing instead to practice radical sharing, inclusion, and peace. We don't have to fall for the fear rhetoric. We don't have to be manipulated into destroying ourselves. What if we, in times of scarcity, instead of hoarding and holding on, shared with others? What if we, when we feel threatened, choose to not be threats? What if we open our doors wide to those who need help? What if we responded with compassion and a want to understand and learn instead of prejudice and fascism? What if we refuse to respond to the war drums that our government and the powers that be keep banging on, and instead courageously choose inclusion and empathy in our neighborhoods, our communities, our society, even when things get hard, even when the world is changing and feels scary? There is a real power in that. A force that few understand just how beautiful and life-changing that can be. It's easy to forget that amidst all the politics and propaganda, at the end of the day, it's up to people. People make up the citizenry. People make up parliament. People make up the police force. People making everyday decisions about what kind of people they'd like to be. What they will accept, what they will go along with, what side they will stand on. We can do something in our little corners, in our everyday lives, and that's what a better freedom is about. A freedom of Jesus, the freedom of following his way. It is a better freedom than that which is often offered us. A truer, deeper freedom that isn't so fragile that it can be threatened by someone foreign or someone in need of help. And that's why I wrote this song, in response to all this. And as it has a tendency to do, it developed and grew into something far larger, a double album.